You know that feeling of betting on yourself when everyone else is waiting to see you fail. The quiet fear that maybe they're right. Maybe the safe way was safe for a reason. But some risks aren't really about money at all. They're about whether you still trust your own two hands. Here's where it begins. A machine sat under a canvas tarp in a farmyard for 11 straight days, untouched, unexplained. Nobody driving past on the county road slowed down for a tarp of 4. This one they did. Loretta Pruitt walked past it twice a day, morning and evening, without ever pulling the canvas back. Grady Pruitt hadn't started the engine once since the morning it arrived on a borrowed flatbed. Something about a silent machine made half of Hazel Creek want to know what it was hiding. Someone in the feed store line said the Pruitts had lost their minds over it. Someone else said it kinder, called it a gamble, the way people talk about things they don't quite believe in themselves. Nobody said either one to Grady's face. Loretta heard it anyway. A burlap sack of chicken scratched heavy against her hip, and she paid for the scratch without answering. Near the door, a man named Dale Whitfield, who farmed 2 sections west and never missed a chance to say what he thought, laughed loud enough for half the store to hear and said the Pruitts would be back to selling raw seed by Christmas, machine or no machine. Loretta only nodded once toward him, the way a person nods at whether they can't do anything about, and carried the sack out to the truck and drove home past the same tarp everyone in town was talking about. What none of them knew yet was why it was there at all. Grady and Loretta had married 19 years earlier in a small white church 2 miles down the same county road, and they had worked that 80 acres together every one of those years without much complaint between them. Neighbors who'd known them both a long time liked to say the two of them argued less than any married couple in Hazel Creek, though the truth was closer to this. They simply argued quietly, over supper, with the door shut, and let it settle before morning chores came around again. Loretta had grown up 2 farms over, daughter of a woman who can vegetables well into her 70s and kept a garden nobody else in the family could match. Grady had grown up right there on that same 80 acres in the same farmhouse, under a father who never once explained why he did anything a certain way. Only did it, and let his son watch closely enough to learn. Neither one of them had ever run the farm alone a single season. They had always run it together, quietly, the way some couples run a household without ever needing to say so out loud. The sunflower field ran along the eastern edge of the Pruitt place, 40 rows deep, heads turned toward the morning like a congregation bowing at once. Grady's father had planted sunflowers on that same ground 30 years before because the soil ran sandy and thin out there, and sunflowers never complained about thin soil the way corn did. Every August the field went heavy in gold, taller than a man's shoulder, humming faintly with bees from sunup to noon. Grady still remembered walking those same rows as a boy of 8 or 9, trailing behind his father with a burlap sack over one shoulder, learning to tell a ripe head from a green one by the way it hung, heavy and slightly bowed, rather than standing stiff and proud toward the sky. His father never called it a lesson. He only worked and let his son watch, and every so often said a single sentence that Grady carried with him for decades afterward, the kind of sentence a boy doesn't understand the weight of until he's a grown man, standing in the same field himself. Every October, a grain truck came rattling up the drive, driven by a man named Ferris Cobb, who bought the Pruitt seed at the exact same price he paid every other farm along that road. 3 years running, the number on his clipboard barely covered the cost of the diesel and the seed to grow it. Grady shook his hand every October anyway. "Thank you," he'd say, because that was how it had always been done out there, because a man didn't argue a number with Ferris Cobb any more than he argued with the weather. It was Loretta who first said the word processed instead of the word sold. She said it on a Tuesday evening in March, over a pot of beans gone half cold on the table, and Grady set his fork down slow, like she'd spoken in another language. "Cold-pressed oil," she told him. "Bottled, sold direct, not hauled off by the truckload to a man who paid the same no matter how good the harvest came in." She'd found the idea folded inside a farming bulletin left behind at the co-op, one page nobody else wanted, and she'd carried that page in her apron pocket 2 full weeks before saying a word about it out loud. Grady didn't laugh. That much later, she was always grateful for. He only asked what a press like that would cost, and when she told him, he went quiet long enough that the beans turned cold in the pot, and then he said they'd have to think on it. They thought on it through April and into May, through planting, through the first thin green rows breaking the soil in straight lines toward the fence line. Some nights they sat at the kitchen table with a shoebox of savings dumped out between them, small bills and folded checks, and a handful of silver dollars Grady's mother had left behind years before, counted and recounted under the single bulb over the table, as though counting it again might somehow make it grow. It never did. Loretta kept a running tally on the back of an envelope, crossing out numbers and writing new ones underneath. And some nights she fell asleep right there at the table with the pencil still in her hand, and Grady would carry the shoebox back to its spot on the closet shelf without waking her, careful not to let the lid rattle. What it covered, just barely, was a used expeller press, advertised out of farm auction 2 counties over, built for outfits smaller than theirs, scarred along one side, missing its instruction manual entirely. Grady drove out alone to look at it first. He walked around the machine twice, laid one palm flat against the cold metal hopper, and said nothing to the seller about how little money sat in that shoebox back home. The auctioneer had rattled through the machine's description in under a minute, calling it as is, no warranty, no guarantee it would run past the first season, and only 2 other men had bothered to bid against him, dropping out quickly once the number climbed past what a machine that old was worth to anyone with better sense. Grady raised his hand one more time than either of them expected, and the gavel came down, and just like that, the shoebox of savings back home had a new purpose entirely. He bought it anyway, on a Thursday, and hauled it home behind a borrowed truck. Half of Hazel Creek had already seen it pass by the time he backed it off the trailer into the yard. What none of them in town understood was the arithmetic sitting underneath the whole decision, an arithmetic that never once showed up on Ferris Cobb's clipboard. A pound of raw sunflower seed sold for pennies. A bottle of pressed oil, the kind found on a grocery shelf in the county seat, sold for more than 10 times that, sometimes 20, for oil pressed from the very same seed the Pruitts grew every summer along that eastern fence line. Grady had done that math on the back of a feed receipt one evening in April, slow, careful, checking it twice. He hadn't shown it to Loretta right away. He'd folded it into his shirt pocket instead, the way a man carries something he isn't ready to say out loud yet, something that might still turn out to be foolish. By the second week, Loretta noticed how quiet Grady had gone. Town talk wasn't what weighed on him. What weighed on him sat under that tarp in the yard, refusing to be simple. He'd expected to feed it seed and watch oil run clean out the other end, easy, the way the seller had described it. Instead, the machine jammed on the 3rd try, seed backing up into the hopper with a grinding rattle that set his teeth on edge. It scorched a whole batch black on the 5th, filling the barn with a burnt, bitter smell that clung to his clothes long after he'd given up for the night and climbed the porch steps in the dark. He scrubbed his hands twice at the kitchen sink before the smell finally let go of his skin, and even then it lingered faintly in the collar of his shirt until Loretta washed it the next morning. He didn't wake Loretta to tell her. She found out from the smell, still hanging in the barn come morning, and from the look on his face before he said a word. Money they didn't have went out the door a second time that month. A new heating element, after Grady cracked the old one forcing a fix that didn't take. A replacement belt. A can of expeller. Lubricant for a machine that seemed to drink oil faster than it made any. Ferris Cobb heard about the trouble before Grady found the nerve to mention it to a single soul, because that was simply how word moved along that road. He drove up the lane on a Thursday afternoon deep in harvest, climbed out his truck slow and easy, the walk of a man who already knew how the conversation would end before it started. He didn't gloat. Grady would say afterward that gloating might almost have been easier to sit through. Instead, Ferris Cobb stood beside the tarp machine with his hands in his pockets and said, gently, there was no shame in it, that plenty of good farmers had tried something new and found the old way suited them fine after all. He'd still take their seed that year. Same as always, he said. No hard feelings, no questions asked. He said it kindly. That was the part that stayed with Loretta longest. She stood on the porch steps through the whole conversation, arms crossed, saying nothing at all, And once his truck rolled back down the lane, she went inside and didn't come back out again the rest of that afternoon. The kitchen light burned long past its usual hour that night. Grady sat at the table with a mechanical diagram spread flat in front of him, one that hadn't come with the machine but had finally arrived weeks late, answering a letter he'd written the manufacturer back in August. Loretta sat across from him without talking, watching him trace the same line on the page again and again with one blackened fingernail. Neither one said the word quit out loud. Neither one had to. It sat right there at the table between them, an easy thing, a thing that would have let them both sleep that night without the smell of burnt seed still caught in their clothes. There's a particular kind of tiredness that settles into a person when they're doubted by neighbors they still have to see every week, at church, at the feed store, at the school gate come Monday morning, and it wears differently than ordinary tiredness ever does. It asks a quiet, persistent question that has nothing at all to do with machines or money or moisture levels in a hopper. It asks whether a person was foolish to believe in their own two hands in the first place, or whether the ones laughing simply hadn't lived long enough yet to see how the story ended. Most of Hazel Creek would have called the Pruitts proud or stubborn, or both at once, and maybe some part of that was true. But pride wasn't what kept the kitchen light burning past midnight in that house. It was something closer to a promise two people had made each other back in March, over a cold pot of beans, a promise neither one had ever said out loud, though both of them understood it exactly the same way. Not everyone in Hazel Creek had laughed. An old man named Otis Ray, who'd farmed the section just north of the Pruitts for close to 50 years before turning the work over to his son, stopped by the following morning with a jar of his wife's chow-chow, and no particular reason given for the visit. He didn't ask about the machine directly. He walked out to the barn anyway, stood by the tarp a while with his hands folded behind his back, and said, almost to himself, that his own father had once rigged a hand press out of the cider mill back before the war, pressing walnut oil for lamp fuel one hard winter when store oil ran short. He didn't offer advice. He didn't stay long. He only said, on his way back to his truck, that a stubborn idea usually turned out to be either foolish or right, and there was rarely any way to know which one beforehand except to keep going. Loretta thought about that sentence for days afterward, longer than she thought about anything Ferris Cobb had said on the porch steps. Loretta found the answer by accident the next morning, the way most true things tend to get found. She was helping fill the hopper while a light rain from the night before still clung to the seed, and she remembered, out of nowhere, something her own mother used to say about drying corn before it went into the crib, about how wet grain and hot machinery never got along together. She said it out loud without thinking much of it at all. Grady stopped mid-scoop, a handful of seed still hovering over the hopper, and looked at her. The moisture, he said, slowly, like the word itself had weight to it. That was the piece neither one of them had thought to check from the very start. They spent the whole next day testing it, batch by batch, seed by seed, spreading handfuls across an old bedsheet in the sun to dry before running them through again. Grady checked the seed between his fingers, dry and brittle instead of cool and damp, adjusting the heating element down a notch, then up half a notch, watching the color of what dripped out, listening for the sound the machine made when it worked with the seed instead of fighting it. The good batches hummed low and even almost gentle. The bad ones ground and coughed, spitting out something dark and thin that smelled faintly of scorched toast. Loretta kept time with a kitchen clock she'd carried out to the barn on a nail, calling out the minutes from a stool by the door, and between calls she sorted dried seed from damp seed into two separate feed buckets, her hands turning gray with dust by mid-afternoon. Grady's shirt stuck to his back under the barn's close heat, and twice he stepped outside just to breathe air that didn't smell like hot metal. Neither of them stopped for lunch until well past 2, and when they finally did, they ate cold biscuits standing up beside the machine rather than walk back to the house and lose the rhythm they'd only just found. Somewhere in the middle of that long, oil-stained afternoon, without either one announcing it, they stopped being a woman and a broken machine and a man standing beside her, and became, instead, two people running one single operation, side by side at the same time. The first clean batch came through just before supper, with no fanfare at all. There was no shout, no drop tools, no running for the house to tell anyone. Grady simply held one hand under the spout a moment too long, felt the oil run warm and thin across his fingers, and went still. Loretta came around the side of the machine to look, and the two of them stood together in the low gold light spilling through the barn door, watching a thin stream of pale amber oil run clean into the collecting pan below, clear enough to see straight through to the bottom. Nothing scorched, nothing bitter, nothing wrong with it anywhere at all. Neither of them mentioned Ferris Cobb that evening. Neither of them mentioned the money already spent or the money not yet earned, or what the rest of Hazel Creek might say once word made its way around, because word always found its way around eventually. They filled 2 mason jars from that first clean batch and set them side by side on the kitchen windowsill, catching the last light of the day, and Loretta said it looked less like cooking oil and more like something poured straight out of a stained glass window. Grady didn't say much back. He only sat down across from her at the table, tired now in a different way than the tiredness of the past 2 weeks, and reached across and took her hand in both of his. There's a kind of arithmetic that never shows up on any farm ledger, no matter how carefully a person keeps their books, one that has nothing to do with bushels or dollars, or the price a truck driver is willing to write on a clipboard. It has to do with what 2 people are willing to risk on their own hands when half the county is certain, kindly or not, that those hands are bound to fail. Was Ferris Cobb ever truly the trouble in all of this? Or was he only the shape doubt happened to wear that particular year? The way doubt always seems to need some familiar shape to stand inside of. Grady never answered that question aloud. Not even to Loretta, though the 2 mason jars stayed on that window so long after the first batch was gone, refilled again and again through every season that followed. Always in the very same spot, catching the very same late light. Each evening the sun dropped low over the sunflower field. The last farmer's market of that season fell on a Saturday down at the county fairgrounds, the kind of gathering that drew half of Hazel Creek out for pie and gossip nearly as much as for produce. Loretta hand-lettered the labels herself at the kitchen table the night before, careful block print on plain paper, glued down with flour paste because there hadn't been room in the budget for anything fancier than that. Grady built a small folding table out of scrap lumber, left over from the barn repairs, loaded it into the truck bed alongside 2 crates of bottled oil, 40 bottles total, more than either of them had dared hope the first proper batch might yield. They set up between a woman selling quilted potholders and a boy selling sweet corn off his family stand, under a sky gone thin and blue with the first real chill of autumn. The fairgrounds smelled of fry oil from the food trucks and cut grass from the mowed field beyond the stalls, and somewhere near the gate a radio played low out of somebody's truck window. For the first hour, most people walked past the little folding table without stopping. The way people glance past anything unfamiliar at a market they've visited the same way for years, their eyes moving on toward the pie stand or the corn or the quilts hung up on wire frames. Loretta straightened the same row of bottles 3 or 4 times just to have something to do with her hands. Grady stood with his arms crossed, watching the crowd the way he might watch weather rolling in from the west, unreadable, waiting to see which way it would break. It was an older woman, someone neither of them knew well, who stopped first, turned a small bottle over slowly in her hands, and asked what made it any different from the oil sold at the grocery in town. Loretta told her plainly, the way she'd tell a neighbor leaning on a fence, about the seed grown right there on their own 80 acres, about the cold press, about no shortcuts taken anywhere along the way. The woman bought 2 bottles. She told the woman standing next to her, before she'd even walked off. By noon, the crate on the left side of the table sat half empty. By 2 o'clock, both crates were gone completely, and Grady stood writing names on a torn scrap of paper for people willing to wait on the next batch. Monday morning, the woman from the potholder stand mentioned the oil to her sister at church. The sister mentioned it to a cashier at the grocery, who mentioned it to a man buying feed later that same week. And by the following Sunday, 3 separate people stopped Loretta after service just to ask when the next batch would be ready. Nobody who stopped her mentioned the tarp or the burnt seed or the talk that had gone around back in September. It was as though that whole conversation had simply been folded up and put away somewhere, replaced by a newer, plainer fact standing in its place. The Pruitts had made something good, and people wanted more of it. Grady noticed the change most on Wednesdays at the feed store, where men who'd once looked past him now stopped to ask, plainly, how the press was running these days. No smirk behind the question at all. Dale Whitfield was one of them. He stopped Grady by the grain bins one afternoon, shifted his weight from one boot to the other, and said, without quite meeting his eyes, that he'd been wrong about the Christmas remark, that his own wife had bought a bottle at the fairgrounds and wouldn't stop talking about it. Grady only nodded, the same easy nod Loretta had given him back in March, and said it happened to the best of them, and left it right there. No more said about it either way. The scrap of paper with names on it from the fairgrounds grew into a proper list tacked beside the kitchen phone. And some evenings the phone rang twice before supper, someone asking, politely, to be added near the top for the next batch, willing to drive out to the farm themselves rather than wait for the following market day. Ferris Cobb wasn't at the fairgrounds that particular day, but word of it reached him all the same, the way everything reached him eventually, filtered through the feed store counter and the church steps and a line at the diner on Main Street. He never said one word to Grady about any of it directly. What he did do, the following October, was raise his buying price for sunflower seed by a margin nobody along that road had ever seen out of him before, quietly, without a single word of explanation offered to anyone. The very same week the Pruitt's second season of bottled oil sold out at the fairgrounds inside of 3 hours flat. He wrote the new number on his clipboard the same way he always had, businesslike, unhurried, and when Grady glanced at it and looked back up, Ferris Cobb only nodded once, the way a man nods at weather that has finally turned, in his favor whether he asked for it or not, and neither of them said another word about it that October or any October after. By the third autumn, the machine that had once sat tarped and mocked in the yard had earned itself a name the neighbor kids used without a trace of irony. The oil press, said the same easy way a person might say the barn, or the well, just another fixture belonging to the Pruitt place. Grady kept a small notebook tacked to the wall beside it. Not instructions exactly, only notes in his own crooked hand about moisture and temperature and timing, the kind of knowledge that only ever gets written down after a person has already learned it the hard way, through burnt batches and cracked parts in one long, patient afternoon spent testing seed against sunlight. Loretta added her own notes in the margins from time to time, in a different hand entirely, and neither one of them ever bothered separating out whose notes belonged to whom anymore. It had stopped matching somewhere along the way, which one of them had figured out which piece first. Neighbor children who came by selling raffle tickets or delivering church flyers sometimes lingered at the barn door just to watch the machine work, and Grady let them stand there as long as they liked, the same way Otis Ray had once let him stand and watch without ever calling it a lesson. He never explained the notebook to them. He only let them see it was there, tacked crooked to the wall, edges softened from years of oily fingers turning its pages. Otis Ray died the following winter, quietly, in his sleep, and at the funeral his son mentioned, almost in passing, that his father had kept talking for months about the Pruitts and their machine, telling anyone who'd listened that he'd known all along it would work out, though nobody could quite recall him saying so at the time. Loretta didn't correct the story. She only smiled at it, and later that week she set a small jar of their oil on the Ray family's porch without a note, the way a person returns a kindness that was never formally given in the first place. The sunflower field still turned its heads toward the morning every August, exactly the way it always had, exactly the way it had turned under Grady's father's care decades before either of them were born to the work at all. What had changed wasn't the field itself. What had changed was everything that happened to what the field gave them. Once it left the ground, once it stopped being raw seed hauled off cheap down the lane and started being something they had made themselves, with their own four hands in their own barn, entirely on their own terms. Some autumns the sunflowers came in thin. Some autumns they came in heavy and gold clear to the fence line. It mattered less than it once had, either way, because a thin year for bushels was no longer the same thing anymore as a thin year for the family sitting at that kitchen table. On the particular evening this story is remembered by, the very one that began with a rumor passed along a feed store line and a burlap sack heavy against Loretta's hip, the light outside had gone the deep gold color that only ever shows up an hour or so before dusk in early October. The kitchen sat quiet. Supper dishes stood, drying on the rack by the sink. 2 mason jars waited on the windowsill exactly where they always waited, one nearly empty from a week of cooking, one freshly filled that same afternoon, and the last sun of the day came slanting low through the glass of both, turning the oil inside the color of something poured straight from a stained glass window, gold and warm and perfectly still. Outside, the sunflower field had already gone dark along its far edges, though the nearest rows still caught a thin band of orange light across their bowed heads, waiting on tomorrow's harvest same as they had every October before this one. Somewhere out past the barn, the tarp that once covered the press lay folded now in a corner, no longer needed, no longer a secret worth hiding from the road. The whole small kitchen held on to that late color for one long, quiet moment, gold caught inside 2 jars of glass, before the light finally moved on past it, the way it always did, the way it always would, come morning, come another season, come whatever the next harvest happened to bring. Have you ever grown sunflowers or pressed your own oil at home? Tell us in the comments. And if you'd stood in that barn with Grady and Loretta the night the oil finally ran clear, what do you think you would have felt? We read every comment you leave us. Thank you for spending this time with the Pruitts. Until the next story, take care.